Welcome back to Grammar for Writers. We're in Lesson 3 of Module 1. Module 1, as you know, is about the main clause, that part of the sentence that answers the question, who did what? And in this lesson, we're going to be talking about how you find the subject and the verb. That's really where sentence analysis starts. I guess you'd say sentence analysis really starts with finding the verb, and then right after that, you find the subject. By way of review, what is a clause? A clause is that unit of grammar that describes a bit of action. It answers the question, who did what? And it always includes a subject and a verb. Now, it may also include other things, like a direct object, an indirect object, a predicate complement, an objective complement. This is true, by the way, of every clause, whether it's a main clause or a subordinate clause. Of course, in this unit, we're only talking about main clauses, but when we get to subordinate clauses in subsequent units, you're going to see that the same things are true. There's always a subject, there's always a verb, and there may be complements or objects. All right. If those words don't mean much to you, words like direct object, indirect object, predicate complement, objective complement, don't worry if those words don't mean much to you now. The whole point of this lesson and the next lesson is to see to it that those words do mean something to you. All right, as I said, when you analyze the grammar of a sentence, you always start by finding the verb. Verbs, as I'm sure you know, express action or they express a state of being. That's not a great definition, in part because there are other words that aren't verbs that express action. As a matter of fact, that word action is a noun. Weird, isn't it? So I'm not even going to offer you a definition of the word verb because I've never really found a satisfactory definition of the word verb. So many grammatical terms are really hard to define. Think about the word the. How would you even define the without using the word the? So instead of a definition, what I'm going to give you is a rule of thumb that will help you find the verb in any clause. Now, this rule of thumb, it's not foolproof, but I think you're going to find it very helpful. And I call it the verb finder. The verb in any clause will fit into one or more of these blanks and form a grammatically correct sentence. I blank, you blank, he, she, it blank. All right? All you need to do is plug the words of the sentence into that blank. The verb will always fit in that blank. So in the sentence, Linda kicked the ball. Stick each of those words in the blank. I, Linda, that's not a sentence. I, thee, not a sentence. I, ball, not a sentence. I kicked, well, there you go. There's your verb. I kicked, you kicked, he, she, it kicked. The only word in that sentence that fits in the blank is kicked. That's our verb. The cake smells delicious. There's only one word that fits. It's not cake. It's not delicious. It's not, well, I smells. He, she, it smells. All right? That fits. You are a sweetheart. What word fits in there? Only are to make a sentence. You are is our sentence, is our verb. All right? Now, by the way, the verb finder works with any tense of the verb. It works with past tense, present tense, future tense. It works for the fancier tenses like past perfect or future perfect, or the progressive tenses, past progressive, future progressive. So in the sentence, and by the way, it's okay if you don't know those tenses. I don't really expect you to. We'll get to them eventually. Think about this sentence. You have said a mouthful. What fits in that blank? It's have said. So that is what we call a present perfect tense. Those two words have said form one verb. So verbs sometimes are actually two words instead of just one. Cindy was working at the glass factory until last year. What fits in our verb finder? Was working. He, she, it was working. Again, two words. That's what is that? A past progressive form. All right. But as I mentioned earlier, I think, our rule of thumb, our verb finder, is not foolproof if you don't apply some common sense. So think about this sentence. You might remember this from last lesson. The raccoon rattled the trash can. When you apply the verb finder to this sentence, you pretty quickly see that rattled is the verb. I rattled, you rattled, he, she, it rattled. Except the word can also fits in the verb finder, doesn't it? I can, you can, he, she, it can. Those are good sentences. I guess for that matter, trash fits in the blank. When I go to the homeschool conventions, I trash my hotel rooms. I'm just kidding. I don't really do that. It only takes a little common sense to see that although both can and trash sometimes serve as verbs, they aren't serving as verbs in this sentence. So here's a somewhat harder example. Rattled by my experience with the alligator, I gave up water skiing. Rattled looks a whole lot like a verb, doesn't it? And it fits in the verb finder. But here it's actually a participle. A participle is a verb that has been turned into a modifier. We're going to get into that when we get into modifiers. But here, it's not serving as a verb, even though it looks exactly, rattled was our verb in the raccoon sentence, right? But here, rattled isn't a verb, it's a modifier. Now, if the verb isn't rattled, what is it? Well, it turns out it's gave up. My point is that the verb finder will find every single verb. Unfortunately, it will also find some other things that aren't verbs. I call these false positives. But if you use common sense, and if you practice a little bit, you can trust that you're going to get better at weeding out these false positives. Now, obviously, we're using oversimplified examples here, right? Each of these sentences is just one main clause and nothing else. However, when we get to much more complex sentences, when we get into subordinate clauses and compound sentences and all that kind of stuff, this verb finder is going to work just as well, and it's going to be just as vital. Literally, I'm speaking pretty literally here. Subjects and verbs are the most important thing for you to learn and for you to get a handle on as you think about grammar. Once you get a handle on subjects and verbs, you're going to find that a lot of writing problems start to fix themselves. So these tools, the verb finder and in a minute the subject finder, you're going to be using these tools over and over again in all your writing throughout this all 30-something lessons of this course, but in all your writing, if you just are really aware of where your subjects are, where your verbs are, you're going to find it makes a huge difference in your writing. Now, before we move on to the subject finder, I do want to say a word about to-be verbs. The most common verb in any language is the to-be verb. Now, I rarely ask grammar students or writing students to memorize anything, but I strongly encourage you to memorize the forms of to-be. And here they are. Am, are, is, was, were, be, being, and been. Memorize that list. Anytime you see one of these words, you have found the verb for the clause that you're looking at. Now, it may be the whole verb, as in Fernando is a deep sea diver. The verb there is just is. Or maybe the to-be verb is a helping verb, as in Fernando was swimming with the sharks. All right? Was is not the whole verb, it's a helping verb for the form was swimming. But once you have found was, that form of to be, you found the verb. Or Fernando was stung by a jellyfish. Again, was is a to be verb. It's not the whole verb, it's part of that passive construction, was stung. But once if you have memorized that list, is, am, are, is, was, were, be, being, and been, if you know that list, then every time you see one of those words, you know you found your verb for a given clause. All right, so when you have found a form of to be, you have found the verb, but pay attention and make sure it may be just part of the verb. Okay, that's all I wanted to say for now. We actually are going to have a whole lesson on the to be verb and when the to be verb has a bad reputation, right? A lot of writing teachers will tell you, hey, get rid of your to be verbs. In a lot of cases, the to be verb is exactly what you need. So there's a whole lesson on what's so great about the to be verb. It's coming up. You're going to love it. Okay, moving on. As I've said repeatedly, every clause has a verb and it has a subject. We've used our verb finder to identify the verb. Now let's use the subject finder to identify the subject. And the subject finder is just a simple question with a blank in it. Remember, you've already used the verb finder to identify the verb, so now just drop that verb into the blank of this question. Who or what blank? And the answer to that question is your subject. So if you start with the sentence, Linda kicked the ball, use your verb finder to see that kicked is your verb, drop kicked into the noun finder. Who kicked? Linda kicked. Linda is our subject. That cake smells delicious. The verb finder helps you find smells is your verb. What smells? The cake smells. Cake is the subject. You are a sweetheart. Who are? You are. You is our subject. Finding the subject isn't any more complicated than that. Now, let me also mention that one of the best features of the subject finder is that it can help you discover if you have mistakenly identified the verb. So let's go back to our sentence, the raccoon rattled the trash can. If for some reason you mistakenly said that can was the verb, you'll see your problem once you apply the subject finder. Who can? Well, nobody can, because that's not what that sentence is about, right? And so that subject finder surprisingly helps you identify when you've made a mistake with your verb finder. Or think about our other harder sentence where we said, rattled by my experience with the alligator, I gave up water skiing. If you say, who rattled, you quickly realize, wait a minute, that's not what this sentence is about. And you realize that rattled, even though it looks exactly like a verb, is not a verb here. All right, let's wrap up. To review, every clause has both a subject and a verb. You can identify the verb using my patented fill-in-the-blank verb finder. I blank, you blank, he, she, it blanks. The verb of a clause will always fit in that blank. Now, unfortunately, some other words may fit in that blank too, so you have to be careful and you have to use some common sense. And you have to practice. Once you have found your verb, you can plug that verb into the fill-in-the-blank subject finder to identify the subject. Who or what blank, and the verb goes in that blank. All right, a clause always has a verb, always has a subject. It may have an object or a complement. Identifying those elements, objects and complements, will be the subject of our next lesson.